If you're new to this podcast, my name is RuthAnn. My husband Lance was sick for 25 of the 27 years we were together, and the last 12 years of his life, I was his full-time caregiver. Today, I'm excited to have a special guest who will talk a little bit about her caregiving experience, which she details in her new memoir, The Murmur of Everything Moving. It is a passionate story of love, uncertainty, and all the complexities that come with a devastating diagnosis much too soon. She has received numerous awards for her writing, which, when you read this book, you will understand why. Maureen Stanton, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
RuthAnn, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk about caregiving today on this wonderful podcast.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to become a writer?
I think that I always was a writer. I just didn't know how to be a writer. So even in my high school yearbook, I wrote my aim was to write a book, and I had no idea how to do that. And I didn't publish my first book till I was 49. So it took me a long time to become a writer. But writing and stories and reading just has always been just my love since childhood. Going to the library and writing poems in fourth grade for the newspaper. It was a long journey to become a writer, but it's been just really rewarding to follow that dream.
Well, to become a published writer, because you've been writing your whole life.
Yes. Yeah, becoming published writer was a little harder than becoming a writer. I think anyone who's writing is a writer. But the publishing industry it wasn't that it was just the publishing industry. I didn't know how to become a writer. So after college, I just followed my heart. I met Steve, the person I wrote about, went out to Michigan and lived with him, had this experience of taking care of him. And meanwhile, I was writing all that time. I was even writing articles for magazines when I was with Steve. And I think it was when I was 35 and that's just a weird age to turn. And I felt like, okay, I've never even tried to be a writer. So maybe I should just change the path of my life. And I quit my job and I lived in a very sort of modest way for a long time, lived on my savings to try and to see if I could handle the isolation of being a writer, and to see if I had what it takes to be a writer. And so, I like house sat, I lived cheaply, and finally I went back to graduate school at 37 and I got my MFA in writing. And again, took me another 10 years after that to publish my first book.
So, what was the reason for the isolation then? I mean, is that pretty typical for writers?
Well, I think if you're writing, you need to have quiet space to write. I mean, writers need a community, but the act of writing, for me at least, I need quiet. I need to not have disturbances. It's partly why they have writing residencies. So, for example, I spent 2 months at the Dell Colony after graduate school, and that was a little bit of heaven because they give you a cabin and you're in there writing and someone tiptoes up to your door with a lunch basket, a picnic basket, and then someone's making you dinner when you're done writing at the end of the day. And it was just like, wow, I don't have to think about anything but writing. You leave your troubles, and your responsibilities elsewhere. And so it just recognizes the fact that to write, you need to be able to just really think and kind of drop down into the moments you're trying to recreate, let that intuitive process bubble up. But then, writers also need community because it's an isolating act. You're not working with a team of people, you're home alone. So you have to find that community.
Right. Well, and especially writing something so intense like this. Was it challenging to write this?
It was challenging. It's a kind of a funny story because I always keep journals, so I had a lot of detailed notes about my experience of taking care of Steve, who had cancer, and he was diagnosed at the age of 29, and without the intention of writing anything about it because I'm a journaler, so I keep journal notes. And then a couple of years later, I started writing some short pieces about it. And then I thought I was done writing about it. And I got to graduate school, and my advisor, I said, "What can I do with these little short essays I had published?" And he said, he actually took one and dropped it in the wastebasket. So that was like, okay, what does that mean? What he really meant was, he said, write a memoir. And I said, I don't know how to write a memoir. And he said, just write a letter to me and say, Dear Bill, his name was Bill Rohrbach, this is what happened. And so in graduate school, that became the first draft of the book. That was 10 years after Steve died. So things were still pretty fresh. And I did have the medical records, but I cried every day writing that book for a year, that first draft. I just saw typing and sobbing and typing and sobbing. And then after a year, after that first draft, there was a sense of removal a little bit, like it was out of me. It was very cathartic. I learned, I re-experienced, I had insight that I didn't really have at the time. And with that distance, I was able to look at the story and think about it from a writer's perspective and think about, well, what do the readers need to know here? How do I keep the story? How do I make it meaningful to people who don't know me and why should they care about my life? So that was the part where the writer came in and looking at it as a text, really. But the first part was reliving that experience. And just it was just emotional. It was just very emotional.
So I think you answered this a little bit, but has writing and sharing your story changed the way you look back on your life?
I've written two memoirs now. One is my teenage memoir, and then this is the caregiving memoir. And I think when you spend time with your younger self or the person you were at the time of going through this, there's two selves that you're dealing with. There's a double consciousness, they call it in writing. And so you're looking at yourself almost as an out of body experience, and you're seeing your younger self, and you're feeling tender or maybe sometimes feeling embarrassed, especially in teenage memoir, feeling embarrassed about, who I was then. But there's some wisdom that comes from that, some insight, and you answer some questions that might have been lingering. So the questions I had with taking care of Steve were, did I do the right thing? Did I push him to do too much alternative? Should I just let it go? I was 25. I had no idea what I was doing. And, should we have gone to Mexico and tried this? So I just didn't know what I was doing. And so as an older person and looking back, I just feel, I felt a kind of just a tenderness toward that person that I don't think I had for myself at the time. At the time, I was just like, let's get going. Let's do what we have to do and just power through each day and take care of Steve and meet all his needs and fight for him and argue with the doctors and, do all the things that you do. And now looking back, I can say, oh, you know what? Maybe I did help him. Maybe I did good things, which I wasn't really able to acknowledge at the time. It was just too much focus. I think it's really useful to look back. And that's why I like writing and reading memoir, because good memoirs not only tell you what happened, they have to go beyond that. And they have to sort of show the things that you now understand and the insight that you gain from that experience. And that's, I think, what helps other people when they read memoir.
Well, so what are some of the memoirs that you've read that really helped you?
I've been writing memoir for 30 years, teaching memoir for 20 years, and I have not found too many memoirs from caregivers. They're really, there's books on caregiving that are how-tos, and so guides for the family and things like that. But for me, what really touches me is personal stories. You can really relate to the person. It feels more real than reading sort of a how-to or guide, even though those are very useful and they have their place. I have to say, I have not found that many memoirs from the caregiver's perspective. There's a whole, school of illness narratives and illness memoirs, but they're often from the person who is ill. And they're not really from the person who's doing the day-to-day caregiving. There is one that was very popular, is Crying at H Mart by Michelle Zahner. I think people may know that her mother had cancer, and she was in her 20s, but she wasn't sort of the daily caregiver all the time. But it is a really lovely memoir and powerful, And there's another one that I really love by Marianne Leone, and it's called Knowing Jesse. Marianne Leone had a recurring role in The Sopranos, so she's an actor, a writer. And this book is about caring for her son who had very severe cerebral palsy. And it is beautifully written and is powerful. And it shows what the caregiver goes through, all the things people say that are just so wrong, the beliefs people have that are just misguided about the illness or the caregivers, and just the love and the dedication and the energy it takes to take care of somebody who has needs like that. So that's a beautiful book that I'd love to recommend. But there's not a lot about, caregivers. It really, from the caregiver's perspective. I kind of searched through my, I keep everything on Goodreads, all the books I've read, and I rate them. I just didn't have that many. I couldn't find that many, from a memoir perspective.
Well, what do you think distinguishes a powerful memoir from other forms of storytelling?
So yeah, memoir. I think with memoir, it's like when you watch a movie and it says based on a true story, and suddenly you're sort of opened up to like, oh, this really happened, and your reaction is immediately different than say fiction. So I think fiction writers have to work hard to get readers to care about their characters. At least they have to work hard to get me to care, because in my mind it's like, oh, these are made up people. Why should I care about them? It has to be really good writing to get me to care about someone. When I read a memoir, I know I'm dealing with a real person and it really happened. And I'm just primed to care. I'm primed to be more empathic towards that story and that person, especially if it's well written. You don't want a memoir that's, I don't know, whiny or self-indulgent or, all these things that memoirs can be. But um, so I think memoir has a really special place in our culture because it's almost like witness testimony, and it's an intimate form. It's people talking to people, sharing your story, making yourself vulnerable on the page. And when you do that, the reader is open to that, and they say, this person is sharing this incredibly personal story, and I appreciate that risk that they're taking. So I think memoir has a really unique way that way that readers encounter and deal with memoir than they do, say, writing a fiction story or short stories, which are beautiful and wonderful and are important to to have fiction in the world and novels. But memoir to me is that special place in my heart. I love reading memoirs, and I do think they do something in our culture that fiction doesn't do.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's such a vulnerable thing to do, to write a memoir. What kind of advice would you have for somebody who wants to write their story, but that vulnerability is so difficult? How did you manage that while you were writing? You said that you went through a couple of processes. Were you less vulnerable in your first writing of it?
I think I was more vulnerable in the first writing of it. So my advisor, the guy that that told me to just write a memoir, I at the last minute, when I had to defend my thesis, which was the memoir, I changed it out. I didn't want criticism of it at that point. I was afraid that criticism of it would be painful, would stop me in the process of writing. So I wanted to keep it private for quite a long time. And that first draft and the drafts after that, at some point I felt safe enough to ask people to look at it and give me some feedback. And these are people I trusted, fellow writers, and that was useful. But so someone writing a memoir, I would say, protect your emotions. You're going to go through an emotional, you're going to re-experience things, and it's going to be emotional. But as the poet Robert Frost said, no tears for the writer, no tears for the reader. Probably a lot of people have heard that. And so my sort of dropping vertically back down to the experience and crying, it made the memoir very real and very authentic and very close. And that I was able to preserve in the memoir. And I feel like if someone had sort of given me feedback really early in the process, it just might have made me feel like maybe I shouldn't write it. Maybe it's, why are you writing this? And what is this family going to think? You just don't want those voices in your head when you're writing it. So I'd say protect yourself that way. And you can build a community and you can be writing without necessarily sharing the early drafts. You can go to a writer's group and you can talk about it. And that, that's one way to sort of protect yourself and to live with the experiences, with yourself. You're living with your younger self. You're living with yourself at that time. You're writing about it. And what I would say is just write everything without thinking that anyone's ever going to read it, so that you can be really honest on the page. Later, at a later stage, You can cut out whatever you need to cut out to protect your privacy and others' privacy. You can, but to get to that authentic story, you have to be really free to just write anything that you want, regardless of what anyone's going to think about it. Just pretend no one's going to read it. And, that way you'll be really authentic. And I think you'll feel safe writing it, especially if it's a bereavement or grief or trauma or caregiving memoir. It's the first draft it's not easy. You relive it, but it can be very cathartic, and it can feel good. It's a weird thing to say, but it can feel good while feeling bad. You can feel sad again, but you can also feel good because you're witnessing, you're paying homage to the fight that the person fought for their life, basically, and you helped them. So it can feel good, but it's going to be emotional, I think. Just be aware of that for
Yeah,
people.
really, in a way to honor their memory too, especially somebody who's gone through cancer. That's such a challenging thing. You did mention writers groups, but what about surrounding yourself with a community of just a good supportive community who aren't necessarily writers, but people that you just trust? Was that something that you did while you were writing too?
Well, I did have in graduate school, I had fellow writers, and you find the people who they see you and they get your writing. Other people are just giving you crazy, suggestions, and you can just leave those aside. But you find those people that get you, and you build that community. I just think community is very important. When I was in two grieving groups after Steve died, and one was just a regular grief group, and there were people of all ages. And then there was this young widows and widowers group that, I wasn't married to Steve, so I wasn't officially a widow, but they did let me in, to the group. And it was people under 45. That was super helpful for almost a year. And that group, was really, really supportive. So there's a support for my emotions, and then there's support for the writing. So I think however you find your community of support is really important, because writing is, it's a lonely thing. Sometimes you're alone doing it. I think it's important to find whatever group support you, whether that's family or friends or fellow writers or fellow people who understand your experience of caregiving and grieving.
So, how did you approach organizing your memoir, structuring it?
So it's interesting because when my advisor in graduate school said, just tell me what happened, I naturally just started at the beginning, which is chronological. And it has mostly stayed chronological because that's the way time unfolds, and it's the way experiences unfold. So I think it's perfectly fine to write a memoir chronologically. I did put a little forward or prologue or a little front section that gave people a sense of what the book was going to be about, that kind of hooked them into it. It was the question that the book was addressing, which is, it's a love story. What is love? What does it take to really love somebody? What do we owe our people that we love? How do we love ourselves in the face of something like that? So that was a question at the beginning that kind of got people, that sort of gives a little hint of the whole arc of the story. And then I did start with how we met and fell in love, and then the diagnosis and the treatment, and then of course accepting that he wasn't going to live. And then the final part is being 27 and trying to figure out how do I be a person in the world at this point? How do I make a life for myself? How do I figure out who I am? And so that does follow that chronological arc. And I've seen a lot of memoirs lately that take a fragmented approach, and I think that can work. And it depends on the story. So something like, there's a book called, and I apologize for the profanity, but the title is Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, and it's by the poet Nick Flynn, and it's a wonderful book about trying to find out who his father is. His father left the family when Nick was a baby. So anyway, his book is a mosaic, so it's little short fragments, and he's a poet, so he writes short, but also he doesn't know who his father is, so he's trying to assemble him from scraps of information, family history, letters. And so that format really fit his story. But I don't think people have to reinvent the way stories are told to tell the three-part, the traditional three-part structure for stories, the dramatic structure, was outlined by Aristotle 1,500 years ago, and it still works today because that's the way we are we as readers, we are trained to read stories that way from the time our parents are reading stories to us. There's a little hook, there's rising drama, there's a kind of tension, and then there's some kind of resolution, and then the denouement. So that structure really works. And when I'm teaching my students and they're writing their memoirs, I'm like, don't feel like you have to reinvent that wonderful way of telling a story, because that's the way time moves. Time moves forward and it moves chronologically, and that's a perfectly fine way to tell a story. And I did tell this story in that just chronological way.
So when you put it in chronological order, then did you go back in and fill in some of the details afterwards?
Yeah, yes, I did. I mean, I did write the draft, and then I did get about 1,000 pages of medical records. And the people at the alternative hospital that Steve was in Zion, Illinois, were so helpful. They didn't charge me anything, and the nurses over time just Xerox these 1,000 pages and sent them to me. And Steve's parents gave permission because I wasn't his legal, I wasn't legally married to him, so I didn't have access to the records. His parents gave that permission. And what I found really useful was the nurses' notes. So the doctors are all just jargon and stuff, but the nurses were in the room, and in their notes, and I don't know if you've seen medical records, but in their notes, they're writing personal things, oh, the girlfriend's there with him, they're watching TV. So it really brought back to me some of those moments in the hospital where I had a lot of time actually, and I did some writing and journaling, but what we were doing, which was so mundane at the time, even though it wasn't mundane because he was getting these alternative treatments. So that helped me fill in, and I had letters and I had pictures. I used artifacts to jog my memory. And so all that's, I did fill in. There's times when you're writing something and then you feel like, I want to make this a scene, so I want to zoom in, I want to bring the readers into the moment with me. And then there's other times you want to pull back and you want to just give summary or exposition, and that's kind of the background story. So you have to sort of negotiate. If you think about it as a film, it's like the camera zooming in close, or it's pulling way back, or there's that medium shot. And so that's what you're doing with writing, is you're bringing the reader in, then you're pulling back out and giving that background. So that I did have to fill in some of that first draft.
Your story is so relatable, and I did go through cancer treatments with my husband. He went through several different types of treatment, but we did go through chemo at one point. And as I read through that part of the story, which is a big part of it, I was just pulled back into my life at that time and felt the intensity of what was happening and the exhaustion. I felt your exhaustion so much. And when I got done reading it, I thought this had to have taken place within a period of about 5 years. I was shocked when I went back through and looked at the dates and realized the short time frame that it was. So it really was intense for just a couple of years.
Yeah, it was really all or nothing for about 18 months from his diagnosis to his death. Our whole relationship was about 4 years. So even though it was a very intense, passionate relationship, we were young and we were very passionate, and that's one of the things that sort of fell away as we lost our physical relationship. And I think a lot of people don't know that what happens. And one of the things that I think I hope that this book will bring to people is for other caregivers, because it is so detailed and brings readers in close, is that caregivers, they will recognize themselves and they will feel like, oh, I understand, and someone understands what I went through. And for people who haven't had the experience, maybe they learn. And maybe when they see someone who is a caregiver, they understand more what that person is going through on a day-to-day basis. Because I continued working part-time for, when I dropped down from full-time to part-time. But when you go to work, people aren't like, oh, how's Steve today? They just, it's too awkward for them to ask all the time. And so you just go about your day as if nothing, nothing is out of the ordinary. And your coworkers, oh, how are you doing? Fine, I'm good. You answer that, because if you really told the truth, and then no one can really handle that every day. So you kind of just, you don't really say that. So I just feel like for people who are caregivers, if they can, they're seen, maybe they're seen in reading this book, like, There are people that know what we went through on a day-to-day basis and how we had to go out into the world and put that face on, do our job at work as best we could without really talking about it too much. I did have one person at work who lost her mother to cancer, and she was able to talk with me about it. So we'd had lunch together sometimes, and it was really nice. She had no problem saying, "How are you doing? How's Steve?" But most people are just like, if I even brought it up, their faces would kind of freeze a little bit, like, don't talk about that.
Well,
So
I think because people just don't know what to say. And I find that on this side of it, having gone through it with my husband, when I see somebody suffering now, I still don't know what to say. So, do you have any advice for people on what to say to someone who is a caregiver and you know that they're struggling?
I think it's fine to say, I can't know what you're going through, but I know that it must be hard. And I just like, just for you to know that I'm thinking about you. There's a lot of people who said, "Oh, let me know if you need help," and I would never do that because I was raised to be self-sufficient, and so asking for help was really hard for me. But this one person I knew who had lost somebody and sort of understood. One day she called me up on a Saturday, and we didn't hang around because Steve was dying, so I was in my 20s, but I didn't socialize, while this was going on. And she called me up on a Saturday. She said, "Can I borrow your laundry?" And I know what she meant was like, I want to take some small chore away from you and make your life a little easier by taking that small thing from you. And of course I said no, because because I was not good about accepting help, but also because laundry is very private. And I'm like, oh, that would be embarrassing for someone to see our dirty laundry. But I just appreciated it so much because instead of saying, let me know how I can help, which I think is very sincere and meaningful, it's very hard for me to then formulate, okay, this is how you can help. I think I could have been better at that, and people should ask for help, but I wasn't. And so I think it was, so I think in the book, I think hopefully it will help people who do not have the caregiver experience yet, because probably everybody will at one point or another, to understand maybe how they can help, maybe how they can even say, they don't have to pretend to understand. And just, and there's a lot of things they shouldn't say, like when God closes a door or he opens a window and things that are like, okay, or you'll find somebody else nice, like the sort of things that people say, well-meaning things that just don't feel right at all. This was meant to be, everything's meant to be, um, and maybe it is, but I don't want to hear that, you know what I mean? Like it's, so so I think, I think people, if they just say, how are you doing? Or, I don't know what you're going through, and I don't even know what to say, but just please know that I'm thinking about you and I care about you. And that's really it. They don't have to have the perfect thing, just express that they care.
I love that. And one thing that really helped me too was just having someone come and sit silently with me.
Mhm. Yeah, just recognition, just a recognition that this is happening in your life instead of people looking away.
Something that really struck me when I was reading your book is, and I thought about this after Lance died too, is that you're with that person all the time. You see the changes in them, and people who are not a regular part of their life, when they see them, it can be a little bit shocking. And this really struck me from your book.
Yeah, it's funny because it's sort of happening right now with my mom who has Alzheimer's. My sister lives near her facility that she's in, and she sees her all the time, and she doesn't think that she's getting worse. And I live 4 hours away from my mother, so I don't see her very much. And I starkly see those changes. You become used to, it's amazing what you become used to. It becomes almost ordinary. This person has this ravaging disease and they're struggling and they're no longer working, and you're no longer having a romantic physical love life. Everything has changed, but everything is still ordinary. You still wake up, you brush your teeth, you have your cereal, your breakfast, you get in little bickering things. It's like, it's ordinary, and it's not ordinary. So in some ways it has to be ordinary. How do you get through life if those basic things, if you can't just sort of get through your day with those basic things. You have to, in some ways, I think, just become inured to the fact that this major life-threatening illness is looming, in your relationship with the person that you love. Um, you have to almost forget it sometimes, even though you can't forget it. So I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but
It makes sense to me. It's something that um, Lance and I always lived. We tried to live and not just exist. So you
Mhm.
set it aside for a while so that you can try to live a little bit, so that your whole entire life is not about this disease that is ravaging his body.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, we tried to, go out to eat. We went away for a weekend to a hotel that had a hot tub and outside in October in Michigan. We went camping. Steve had 3 kids from his first marriage, so we took them camping. We tried to do, have this ordinary life. And it got more difficult towards the end as his body was really failing. But for the first probably year, we did try to have that ordinary life. We had celebrated his children's birthdays, got them presents. You do, that's where you're sort of forgetting. You can't just stop everything. You have to continue living.
Such an important thing to do. But one of the things that I found doing that was that it kind of makes it look like things aren't as bad as they are. So that makes me even happier that you've written this book. I know that it was so hard to write, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my tendency, I mean, we do have a tendency, I think, to hide maybe some of what's going on just to get through. You can't go walking to the grocery store crying. So you hold it in and hold it in, and then you get in your car. And like I did when I had after Steve died, I had a new job. Nobody knew him where I was working. It was like he was erased to them. And then I would get in my car at 5 o'clock. I wouldn't even get out of the parking lot of the building where I worked. And I would just sob. I had an hour-long commute at the time. And I just cried in my car. And I had so many tissues balled up and thrown on the seat of the floor of my car that when my sister got in the car at one point, she's like, ew, like, what do you have, this long cold? She didn't understand the grieving. How can you until you go through it, really? And so, even when he was sick, you still had to go to work. I had to put on a face. I had to write press releases. I had to do things like that were utterly meaningless, really, when in the big picture of things. But you do have to continue. I went on job interviews while Steve was sick, and it felt very weird. I had to just have this straight face of like, well, this is what I can do for your, organization. And it just was very surreal, I think. Probably you had some of that experience as well. It's the two worlds that you're navigating, and it's a surreal world and then the real world, and they kind of switch. Sometimes the real world is surreal, and sometimes your private home world.
Oh, that's a great way of putting it. Do you ever look back on that time in your life and think, how did I do that?
You know, I guess I do. Like looking at the book and going, wow, that was 18 months where I just dedicated every minute of my life to Steve, except for the moments I had to go to work, 4 hours a day. But then I realized I was young. I was young. I had energy. So caring for my mother now, so I'm in my 60s and she's in her 80s, and I stayed with her for 4 months a couple of years ago before she was in assisted living. She broke her arm and she still had the dementia, and she didn't know why she fell or what happened. She was non-compliant. So I stayed with her for 4 months. It was very challenging. My health took a hit. So doing this in your 20s, and you were young too, doing this when you have more energy. And I think in some ways the naivete I had in my 20s helped, because I was like, I can see now looking back that there were my counselor at the time and doctors looking at me like, she thinks he's going to live. She thinks they're going to beat this. But I didn't even see that at the time. Like, we are going to beat this. So that was like just naive, the naivete of someone in their 20s, like, I can't even, I'm just going to react and I'm going to do things, just kind of be headstrong about it. I would be different now in my 60s, I think. First of all, I don't have the energy, but secondly, I would be more measured and cautious about some of the things that we did.
Right. But I think there's something to be said for having that hope, though. That does keep you moving forward. That does give you a reason to keep going.
Yeah, I mean, we had to have that hope. I mean, he was, young when you're young, and he had his three kids, and just like his parents, when we got the diagnosis, which was very poor, the doctors literally said he probably would live 2 months at the most, and he ended up living 18 months. And so my reaction was, well, we've got to fight this. We've got to do everything we can. People survive. They've survived these prognoses. There are these few people that can, beat this somehow through alternatives or meditation, whatever it is. We've tried everything. Um, and his parents, their reaction was, let's arrange for hospice. And I was shocked. I was like, what? No, he's only 29. He has three young children. He's a young man. Um, but and so that hope did keep us going and kept him going, for a long time too. And of course, he was a young man, so he had a strong heart, and he much outlived the poor prognosis that he got. But yeah, you have to have that hope, and I didn't ever give up hope. I think he gave up at some point, realizing that the treatment he was taking such a toll on him that he just couldn't do it anymore. And he accepted that he wasn't going to live before I did. I was like, I'll keep going. I'll keep trying new things. I'll keep caring for you for as long as it takes. And so maybe that's where the hope comes in, is that you just keep doing it. You keep going.
Yeah. Looking back, since you had your book published, are there any parts that you wish that you would have left out? Are there any parts that you wish you would have put in there?
So there's the one part that I really struggled with, and that is in when the last hours of Steve's life. His body was breaking down. We didn't have hospice because we had moved. We had great hospice in Ann Arbor, and then we moved to he wanted to go home to his parents' house, the house that he was born in and raised in. So 2 weeks before he died, we moved there, and we hadn't connected with the local hospice. So we didn't have hospice. So his process of dying was it was messy, and it was very graphic. And so I questioned, should I put that in there? The 5 hours of him dying, what happened to his body, us trying to take care of him without really knowing what we were doing and what was going on. Is this taking away his dignity to show his body failing like that? So I struggled with that. And in the end, I just kept it in. I thought, we have this taboo about death. Death is, people think it's a couple of raspy breaths and then you close your eyes, and you know what, that happens. My dad had cancer and I took care of him too. And, that's how he died. But he had hospice and they gave him a ton of pain medications, but I think they knew, so Steve didn't have that. So it was just a more physical, body breakdown, and the moaning and howling and things like that. So, but I wanted to face the taboo that we have in our culture of looking at dying and death so that people understand. And maybe, if they're in that situation, well, this is normal. This is what to expect. This is what happens. And I came to the conclusion at the end that it's not, it's more dignified to show what he went through, because it's not him, it's his body at that point. So I kept that in, but that was a real challenge I had, sort of emotionally and intellectually, of how graphic I should be with his process of dying, which is literally the last it was the last 2 weeks, but the last 5 hours when he was really actively dying. And I decided to keep that in, but
Good.
that was a struggle.
I'm really glad that you left it in. That's something that, because of the community that I've been a part of for 30 years, I have known a lot of people who have died from cancer, and nobody wants to talk about what happens. And when Lance was on hospice, I was desperate for somebody to tell me anything. I was getting some information from the hospice team. The hospice nurse is a friend of mine. And so she would tell me something. So I did have some idea, but to hear it from the perspective of a caregiver, who's caring for the love of their life, someone that they deeply care for, someone that they deeply love, it's very different than hearing the perspective of a hospice nurse. And so I am really, really glad that you left that in there. And for anyone who is going through cancer treatments, who's caring for someone that they love, who is dealing with cancer, and you're worried about that process, your book really gives a very great description of it. So thank you for putting that in there.
Thank you for saying that. And I have had other people tell me they were happy that that was in there because it's something that they recognize with their own experience, or they had their mother or their grandmother go through that, and it's really not what we see in, say, pop culture. People don't write about that, and so I think it hopefully will help break down the taboo of talking about and looking at people dying. It's like birth and death. It's like what we go through, and so why should that be anything shameful or anything hidden? So I'm glad. Thank you for saying that. I'm glad that you appreciated that was in there.
Well, I appreciate your vulnerability in sharing it.
And the hospice nurses, they that you're right, they will tell you things, but they also won't tell you that, they're trying to protect you in some ways. I am a person that wants a lot of information. I want to know exactly what to expect. What can I do? What should I be doing? And I didn't have that. And had I had a hospice nurse, they probably would have just pumped Steve with a lot of painkillers and stuff, so he wouldn't be just sort of moaning and and feeling what I felt like was feeling pain. I could only give him so much painkiller with the system they had, the bolus that they can give him, and it wasn't enough. Um, and so I feel like at least that might educate some people about how important hospice can be in terms of, mediating those final hours so that there isn't pain.
Right. And it's hard. I mean, I went through that with my husband, Lance, with actually it was the last 3 days of his life where he was heavily medicated. And it's hard. It's hard to think about having them medicated, but I couldn't imagine him not being medicated. And I'm so thankful that we had hospice. Hospice is something that you're right, a lot of people have a hard time with. They don't want to talk about it, but it is such an important part of the process, and it does keep the patient comfortable, and it helps the caregiver too. It helped me so much having him on hospice.
Yeah, the hospice that we had in Ann Arbor, they were a paid hospice. They were nurses. They were amazing. They took care of me too, which was great. And so the hospice went in Jackson, Michigan, which were the last 2 weeks of Steve's life, they were volunteers. And so they weren't really that present. And they didn't know us. So they didn't feel maybe obligated to come out or whatever that was. But I think one of the things, like with my dad, for example, he died of cancer at 80 and he had hospice. And the morning that he died, I was supposed to give him, they just gave him a lot. They just increased his pain medication, doubled it when they could see that he was going through those stages of that he's going to be dying. And my sister and brother hadn't seen him, and they were coming down several hours drive from Maine to Massachusetts. And I said, I'm not going to give him the morning pain medication. I want him to be a little bit more lucid when my siblings come to say goodbye. But then he started the agitation in the morning, and I got really scared. Like, what do I do? For some reason, there was no person that morning. I don't know why. Maybe because I was there. And so I ended up giving it to him a few hours late, but I ended up giving it to him. And my sister and brother arrived, and he passed away probably 20 minutes later. So at least I got to maybe hopefully communicate with him, even though he didn't speak. Um, but I'm happy that they gave him the painkiller so he wasn't in that agitated state and feeling any pain at all.
So you've been through a lot of this. You've done a lot of caregiving.
I have, and I'm not sure. Like, it might be that I am I have four sisters, and I am the daughter that doesn't have any children, and so and also my job as a professor gives me a lot of flexibility in my schedule on campus, but then I'm mostly doing work at home, so I could go down and help my dad, um, and be with him. And with Steve, I was young enough. I didn't have a big important job. I could just drop it and do what I needed to do. And with my mom, I was able to I took family leave and helped her. And I did go down and live with her for 4 months another time when she broke her arm. Um, and it's a strain and it's a stress, but I love my mother, I love my father, and I love Steve. And I was really happy to do that for them.
It's something that I think it's an experience that is really hard to describe. It's so hard, but I can say that I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm so glad that I went through that time with Lance and that I was there with him when he passed.
I think that it makes you a much more tender person and compassionate for everyone around you. I feel like once I went through that experience with Steve, I just I mean, I was always an empath, I was always a crier and an empath when I was a kid and growing up. But it just made me feel and understand the pain other people experience, and to just be more empathic to and compassionate for human suffering of any kind. It just really awakens you to something kind of beautiful, even though it's painful. It's really just love. Um, that's what I wanted to write about, love.
It is. It's a beautiful love story too.
Thank you.
Just getting back to publishing really quick, for someone who's wanting to write their memoir, would you recommend collaborating or just writing it themselves or hiring someone else to do it? And once you get to the point, what is the process of publishing a book like? And is it better to self-publish or to find a publisher?
So I'm going to take those three separate questions. And the first one is the collaboration question. And I think it really depends on each individual. Like I was always a writer, so I knew I would be writing this. But I actually met somebody last night at a reading I gave who's a poet, and she's ghostwriting a book for her friend. The friend is not a writer, and she trusts her friend to write. So they had a series of interviews. And I have another friend who's a writer who ghost wrote a book for a young I think he was in his 20s, and he had I think a skateboarding accident and became uh, a quadriplegic. And his story is very inspiring. And my friend Jason wrote it. And my friend Jason's a beautiful writer. So the story was written beautifully. So he was able to convey, the voice of the person that he was writing about. So if you get a good ghostwriter, there's nothing wrong with that. It's fine. If you're not a writer, you're not a writer. If you enjoy the writing process, I think the writing process is in itself a cathartic process. It's a way of processing things by putting it down on the page. Writing is thinking. So when you're actually writing, things are generating. It's very generative, intuitive ideas are bubbling up, memories are bubbling up. So there's something beneficial about writing it yourself. But there's nothing wrong with getting help at any stage, whether it's a ghostwriter or whether it's a development editor later. So you've got all your raw material down, and who knows how to write a book? I didn't know how to write a book when I started this. And so you have people that are developmental editors, and they can come in and help you. It's something that I used to do when I was freelancing, and it's called book doctoring. And I would take someone's memoir, and I could see the story there, but I could see that if they rearranged it, if they excavated certain extra material that didn't need to be in there, the story would come through more powerfully. So I did that as a consultant. And so there's plenty of people that do that. And then as far as publishing, there's so many avenues now for self-publishing. It used to be that self-publishing there had a kind of a stigma about it, but now I think people who are self-publishing can do well. But if you self-publish, you have to realize that there's not going to be an entity there that's going to help you market the book and publicize it and promote it and sell it. So you also have to do that part of it. You can hire publicists, but generally you're going to have to go to bookstores and arrange things and have social media platform or get the word out there. That can work really, really well. If you have a social media platform already, you can do very well self-publishing. There's things like Substack and Medium, so you can serialize your story and publish it and get followers that way, and that works very well. But if you want to go the traditional route, you probably should take your manuscript to the point where it reads like a published book. The grammar is correct. There's no usage issues, things like that. And then you can shop it around with an agent, or you can try a smaller press, a university press or an independent press. They will usually accept manuscripts without an agent. If you want to be published by some of the larger, like Penguin or Houghton Mifflin, Harcourt, they're all merged now, so I don't even know what they're called, but Random House, you need an agent to get through that. Some of the things that I did before I went to graduate school, when I kind of knew, I was writing and I wanted a writing community, is that I would do these 1 week, I would take a vacation, my vacation time from work, and I do these 1 week writing workshops. And they have them everywhere. I went to one in Maine at Stone Coast. I went to one out in Iowa. And you're generally staying in the dorms in the summertime, and you're meeting people of all ages, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And you're having a workshop, and you're sharing your work, and you're working with mentors. And it keeps you in a writing community. You do get valuable feedback. And it felt good to do that. And then there are online classes. There are, for example, in Boston, we have something called the Grub Street, and there people can take a class in any aspect of writing, writing a book proposal, finding an agent, publicizing, how to develop your story, how to, and memoir, fiction, poetry, and they're all, because Boston is such a literary rich city, they're all working, successful writers that are teaching these workshops. Some of them are one day, some of them are 2 weeks, some of them are 8 weeks. So I think a lot of cities and places, and anyone can take them. You don't have to be from Boston because they're online. Um, that helped me too. I did a few of those. And it's just a way to keep my toe in the writing world and to take myself seriously and say, this is a book that I want to see through to publication. So I'm gonna start investigating and exploring what that means. I eventually decided to go and get an MFA and spend 3 years doing that, but you don't have to do that. Nobody has to do that to be a writer. You just have to write and write your book. And there's plenty of help out there for whatever level you want and for whatever aspect of writing. There's lots of help out there, and people should ask for that help if they need it. But I don't think there's any. Find a ghostwriter if you want your book to be written, but you don't feel like you can write it. And that's, like I was telling somebody last night, Andre Agassi, the great tennis player, has a memoir called Open, and it's really good. And I thought, Andre Agassi, not only is he a great tennis player, he's a great writer. And then I found out it was ghostwritten by Jay Moringer, who wrote The Tender Bar, which they made a movie out of, a beautiful memoir they made a movie out of. He ghost wrote Andre Agassi's book. The ghostwriter is not, it's not there in the, on the page that says by Andre Agassi with Jay Moringer. It's not there, it's hidden. But a ghostwriter can help you make a really beautiful book of your story.
Well, how do you go about finding a ghostwriter then, and finding one that is good, that is going to be able to tell it in your voice?
So what you probably do is you would look at, say, Poets and Writers magazine, and they have a classified ad, and they have ghostwriters. I think if you Google it, you'll find things like Poets and Writers, like Writers Union, or National Writers Union, or the Authors Guild, and you'll find names. And what you would do is you would ask them for samples of their writing, or if you can somehow see their style of writing, and meet with them and see if there's a connection. There has to be a connection. Maybe they even have an experience that's similar, or maybe their writing is just so beautiful and lovely. Maybe other books they've ghostwritten are books that you can admire and you think is the way you want your book written. So it's just like interviewing any kind of professional. You want to talk to a couple different people and see who would be the best one for that. Sometimes people ask me to do it because they know my books, and I'm like, I don't have time because I teach full time. I'm trying to write. I'm taking care of my mother, everything else. But I can sometimes direct them to friends I know who are doing ghostwriting. So if you have writer friends, and if you know writers, ask them. That's a good place to start. They might not know, but they might have another writer you can ask that would know.
Oh, that's great advice. Well, is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to share with our listeners?
One of the things that I really, I guess if I could tell myself as the younger person, if I could give myself advice to that 20-something-year-old person I was, is to make sure as a caregiver you take care of yourself, and to not be embarrassed or ashamed to ask for help, to understand that you need help, and to I always felt guilty when I took time away from Steve, but I had this wonderful counselor, Kendra Lynn in Ann Arbor, and she forced me to go out with my sister and have a beer once a week. And I didn't always do it, but and Steve would say, well, is it really so important to go out for a beer with your sister? I mean, I'm here, lonely all day. And he wasn't trying to guilt me, but he couldn't understand why I would do that. And then Kendra was like, you have to do it. You have to do it. Steve wanted me to quit my job so I could be with him. He wanted to spend all our time together. And Kendra was like, don't quit your job. Don't leave your foot in the world of the living. But I always felt guilty. So what I would say to caregivers is, do not feel guilty taking time for yourself, and make sure you take time for yourself, because it's like putting the oxygen mask on yourself first before you assist your child on the plane. You have to remain healthy and sane and emotionally and psychologically strong. And so you need to take care of yourself as well. And I didn't, even with Kendra helping me, I didn't. And when Steve died, I was a little lost. And I looked at my teeth, and they had teeth. I didn't go to the dentist the whole, for years, because I wasn't focusing on myself. I was like, my teeth are staying, like I wasn't even taking care of my basic needs. So that would be the one thing I would want people to understand, is that you have to take care of yourself. I always thought, well, that's two people to take care of. I can't take care of two people, so I'll just take care of Steve. But you have to take care of yourself.
Right. You have to take care of yourself, or you're not going to be able to continue. Uh,
Yes.
I'm really thankful that I learned that early on, um, self-care, but even I didn't do a great job of it the last decade of his life because it was so intense. And
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot to it. So,
Yeah.
well, I so appreciate you being here and sharing all of this with us. Can you tell our listeners how to find your book?
So my book, called Murmur of Everything Moving, is it's available at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, bookshop.com, Target, a few other places. They may not have it, but they have it online. They may not carry it, but independent bookstores, some of them have it, I know. But it's available in digital. So if you like reading on your Kindle, and it's available in paperback, which is a little bit cheaper than hardcover, so that's good. But I always find that if you ask a library to stock a book, they will order it for you, or they'll get it from a library in their network. So I'm happy to have people should go to their library and get the book as well. So yeah, they can read little excerpts of it if they go to my website. There's a couple little excerpts.
And what's your website?
It's maureenstantonwriter.com.
Okay. So
Thank you so much. I really appreciate having this conversation. It was deeply meaningful to me, and I've loved meeting you and hearing your story. And I love what you're doing.
well, thank you so much for being here, Maureen. And I encourage everyone to go out and buy the book, check it out, read it. It's a great story.
Thank you.